Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Oregon Conservation Partnership webinar on the National Flood Insurance Plan. I hope everyone was able to get on okay. My name is Vanessa Green, and I am the Executive Director for the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. I will be serving as the facilitator today and keeping an eye on the questions. This webinar is part of a monthly webinar series organized by the Oregon Conservation Partnership. We use this forum for training and information exchange for soil and water conservation districts, watershed councils, and land trusts in Oregon, but we welcome anybody to jump on. This is a public event. These webinars are offered by support from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and we thank them for their support. We have 71 people registered for the webinar from a range of organizations today, so we want to say welcome, and we are really happy to have you here. In a minute, I'm going to hand it over to our first presenter, Ms. Celinda Adair. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. Everyone but the panelists and myself are muted by default, and there are a couple of ways you can interact during the webinar. To ask a question during the presentation, please type it into the question box, and I will relay that question to the presenters at the end of their presentation. As we prepared for today, we discussed the possibility of asking questions back and forth during the presentation, and they felt that the information that you are asking questions about might be answered in the course of the presentation, so we decided to stack it so that all of the information is at the beginning and the questions are at the end. So if you ask the question and I'm not getting to it right away, I want you to know the reason why. There is also the option to hit the little hand icon, and that tells me that you want me to unmute you so that you can ask your question directly. You can also feel free to do that as well. I want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted by early next week on the Oregon Conservation Partnership website, along with the PowerPoint for today. So feel free to share the link with colleagues who couldn't make it. Additionally, I have attached a PDF version of the slides that Ms. Adair and Cooper will be going over today. So I wanted to draw that to your attention. So if you like, you can download them, print them out, and follow along on your own. Today, we welcome Ms. Celinda Adair and Ms. Erin Cooper as our presenters. Ms. Celinda Adair serves as the National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator with the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. Ms. Erin Cooper serves as the Senior National Flood Insurance Program and Endangered Species Act Specialist for the FEMA Region 10 Mitigation Division. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Celinda. Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate the great introduction, and I want to thank the Conservation Partnership Group for giving us this opportunity to provide this outreach to you and information. So I'm going to lead off here for a sec, and then I'll transfer it over to Erin Cooper with FEMA Region 10. The topic of our presentation is the habitat restoration in the floodway, FEMA's rescindment of the Fish Habitat Enhancement Structures Regional Policy, and what that means for folks doing fish enhancement work or habitat restoration work here in Oregon. I want to start off the presentation with an overview just so that we're all on the same page, since I'm not sure of everyone's background or knowledge of the National Flood Insurance Program. It's a national program run by FEMA. It started back in the late 70s. It has three main components: floodplain mapping, floodplain management or regulation, and flood insurance. It is primarily an insurance program. Communities voluntarily join and they regulate their local floodplains in compliance with standards identified in the Code of Federal Regulations by FEMA in exchange for access to federal flood insurance for residents. There is a connection between the ESA and the NFIP, and Erin Cooper is going to address that a little bit later in this presentation. And then we're going to go over in detail the FEMA Region 10 Fish Enhancement Structures Policy and the rescindment and what that means. So first overview, bear with me here as we go through a bit of the background and facts to make sure we're all on the same page. National Flood Insurance Program. The federal program is really there to ensure that you're reducing flood losses and damage to structures and property within the floodplain. There are local community regulations that apply, And communities agree to enforce minimum NFIP standards in exchange for access to that insurance, as I mentioned before. It's actually private insurers that write the policies based on an agreement with the federal government. So people might go to State Farm or some other group for their actual insurance policy, but it's underwritten by the federal government. The purpose of the NFIP is really to try to promote safe development within the floodplain that protects people and their lives and property during disasters. Here in Oregon, just last February in Umatilla, we had a bad flood, and we are prone to them here. So it's a big emphasis on floodplain management in a way that reduces risk, promotes life and safety. One of the key factors is trying to reduce the disaster costs associated with it and shift the burden from general taxpayers to floodplain occupants, which can be a hard road to travel. Providing insurance coverage is really necessary from the federal government because while it's increasing the amount of private access to flood insurance or private flood insurance policies over the last couple of years, for really the last 20, maybe 30 years, it's been very hard to find private flood insurance policies, and if they were available, they're extremely expensive. And so the federal government stepped up to fill a vacuum to provide coverage after some pretty catastrophic flooding throughout the nation. One thing to really understand with this is that the focus of the National Flood Insurance Program's floodplain management regulations is the built environment. Most of the regulations focus on standards for building. They do go into excavation and fill and other types of activities, but a lot of the focus is on structures, maybe manufactured dwellings, recreational vehicles, your standard residential or non-residential structures, and making sure that when they're placed in a floodplain, they are done so in a way that is safe for them. Typically that involves elevating or floodproofing them. There are some situations where like mechanical or electrical or other standards also apply. And a lot of the regulations are echoed in the Oregon residential or structural specialty codes and other specialty codes. There are standards that focus on fill, excavation, and grading and other development activities because it's recognized that those activities can increase or affect the risk to properties. So something you do upstream will have an effect downstream. And if someone's built to a certain level, thinking that's safe and compliance, and then you alter the floodplain upstream, that can change the flood risk for that structure and cause someone to now be at risk of having water up and into their structure. Insurance is really focused on the structure. They insure primary structures and in some cases secondary structures. It doesn't really insure your property or crops or things. The other thing is that the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, which we'll talk more about in a second, they are very static. They're very slow to change. It's 5 years oftentimes for those to shift and be updated. And they do take a fair bit of engineering analysis, survey data, and other information to compile them and create them. The way FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program does floodplain mapping is really they get topographic data. Nowadays it's LiDAR data. They survey cross-sections and stream crossings or structures like bridges and culverts. They put that together. They do a hydrology analysis to determine the flow. And then they basically take that volume of water and run it through hydraulic modeling, typically HEC-RAS or some other format of hydraulic modeling, to determine where that amount of water is going to go. We use some key terms we'll talk about in a moment. The regulatory floodplain, also known as the 1% annual chance floodplain or the 100-year floodplain, is also typically referred to as the special flood hazard area. Within that special flood hazard area, it's broken into two portions. The floodway, which isn't mapped for all streams, but where there's detailed information and funds available is mapped. And the floodway is the stream channel and the portion of the stream area where the fastest, deepest water and debris is projected to go. The flood fringe is off to either side of that, and typically there is less restriction in the flood fringe than there is in the floodway. There's a lot more restrictions on what can be done in the floodway because that area is largely to be kept free of development so that development can occur in the flood fringe. A floodway under the NFIP, as I said, it's the channel of the river, the portion of the floodplain that's reserved to convey that 1% annual chance flood or the 100-year flood, that amount of water. The velocities there are the greatest. It's where the stream, when it initially swells up, is going to have its fastest currents. It's not standing water, it's your fast moving water. And the regulations and provisions of the National Flood Insurance Program that are echoed in local communities' regulations really aim to limit development within this area. The other term you're going to want to know, because we're going to refer to it a lot later on in this presentation, is a base flood elevation. That's or a BFE, as we like to throw around acronyms in this program. The base flood elevation is the height the water gets during that 1% annual chance flood. This image here you're seeing is an image of a FEMA flood insurance rate map. You will see the red and blue hatching that represents the floodway area. The blue that is labeled Zone AE represents the flood fringe, and the base flood elevation is represented with black, typically squiggly-ish lines, and it has it printed right there. You can see 14.3, I've circled an example. On the maps, they show these at set intervals, but there is actually a flood insurance study that comes with this mapping information so that you can determine precisely a BFE really at any location within the mapped floodway and floodplain. The floodplain mapping information for any local communities is available online at the FEMA Map Service Center. The portal allows you, kind of like Google Maps, to type in an address. If the community has digital versions of their flood insurance rate mapping, not all of Oregon does, unfortunately, but a large portion do, especially Western Oregon, then you can see really quickly by typing in the address what the floodplain mapping is for that location. If they don't, it'll refer you to paper maps, PDF format, which largely in Eastern Oregon is the case. But you can still download those PDFs. You can also download GIS versions of the data where it's digital from the Map Service Center as well. They're called the National Flood Hazard Layer or the DFIRM database. The National Flood Hazard Layer is a map viewer where you can view the GIS version of the floodplain mapping data for all those communities that have a digital version available. One of the differences between it and the Map Service Center is that where there have been corrections or revisions to the map that are minor, specific only to one or a couple limited number of parcels, we call those letters of map change, which can be a letter map revision or a letter map amendment, or something to that regard. Those actually show up if you turn on a layer on the National Flood Hazard Layer. So that's one of the reasons to use it if you're looking for those revisions, in addition to just the regular mapping information. So a little background on how Oregon handles floodplain management under the National Flood Insurance Program. The authority is delegated down to the communities. So each local community adopts floodplain regulations. They have to be compliant with the minimum standards of the National Flood Insurance Program. Those are outlined in the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 44 CFR 60.3. And those regulations typically are focused on development that can occur in the floodplain. They have higher restrictions. It's called a floodway encroachment restriction that limits a little bit in more stricter sense what you can do within a floodway versus the flood fringe. They cover things like fill and excavation, alteration of waterways, a wide variety of standards and topics, but a lot of the focus is on residential or non-residential structures. Communities, to maintain their participation in the National Flood Insurance Program and to maintain that access to flood insurance for its residents, are required to adopt those minimum standards. We have an Oregon Model Flood Hazard Ordinance that's on our DLCD NFIP website. Communities can use that as a starting point as the bare minimums, but it's important to note that local communities can adopt additional standards. They have to meet the minimums, but they can do anything that goes above that. And so it's really important to check what the regulations are for the community specifically that you're interested in or dealing with, because they may be slightly different from other communities in Oregon. As I say, the minimum is the base, but it can be, there's additional standards. And some communities have stricter prohibitions on development in the floodplain or the floodway than others. Under the NFIP, one of the requirements is that communities track and monitor development within their floodplains, and this is done through floodplain permitting. Communities are required to have forms that capture both structural and non-structural development and application processes to review that proposed development activity against their local floodplain regulations and ensure compliance. In some flood zones, like the floodway, often additional engineering analysis is required to determine if the proposed activity is going to increase that base flood elevation, that height of the floodwater in that 100-year or 1% annual chance flood event. We call that typically a rise analysis. The requirement that's standard is typically that there is a no rise allowed unless a conditional letter of map revision is approved by FEMA that would allow it. We'll talk more about those in a little bit. One question I get asked a lot is NFIP participation mandatory? It is not. However, it is one way that communities can meet Goal 7 of our state planning goals. The other real reason is that if they don't participate in the NFIP, access to flood insurance is extremely limited. While private flood insurance can still be available and is becoming slightly more available, in a lot of cases, they only want to pick up low to moderate risk properties. What this means is if you're going to sell a property within the floodplain, right now, banks that are backed by the federal government, so federally backed mortgage lenders, have a requirement, a separate law that requires that for any property that they're going to issue a mortgage on within a mapped special flood hazard area, that 100-year floodplain and floodway, they have to ensure there is insurance coverage for that property for them to issue that mortgage, otherwise they face a fine. What that means is any time somebody's trying to sell their property and someone else is buying it, or someone's trying to remortgage their home, they have to be able to get flood insurance to get a federally backed mortgage. So if they're not able to have access to flood insurance because they don't participate in the NFIP, it may really prevent them from selling, remortgaging property. It also can limit access to federal grants after a disaster, or basically if something happens, the access to disaster funding and individual assistance or things like that for structures that are damaged by a flood can be drastically limited or not accessible if they're not participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. There are some other minor ramifications that I won't go over right here. So for the next part, and hopefully this established a bit of a foundation about what the National Flood Insurance Program is, how it is regulated here in Oregon, who that regulatory authority is, which is primarily the local community. However, they must make sure that their regulations comply with the federal minimum standards. So to go over the connection between the ESA, Endangered Species Act, and the NFIP, I'm going to go ahead and transfer it over to Erin Cooper from FEMA Region 10.
Thank you, Celinda. Yeah, again, I'm Erin Cooper. I'm the person at FEMA Region 10 who tries to mesh the worlds of floodplain management and Endangered Species Act, both understanding and compliance. So while we're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program and floodplain management here today, I wanted to make sure we understand how the Endangered Species Act kind of plays a role in all of this. So if you go to the next slide, Celinda. There we go. So the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is pretty straightforward. It's to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems on which they depend. So when we think about the threatened and endangered listed species within floodplains around Oregon, we're in the context of the National Flood Insurance Program, we're really concerned about the habitat that is impacted by floodplain development in these locations. And because the National Flood Insurance Program is a federal program under a federal agency, as we have to think about ESA's Section 7, which really requires federal programs and federal agencies to make sure that our activities don't impact or impair these listed species or the critical habitats on which they depend. And that connection is written into this Code of Federal Regulations that Celinda referenced and that we'll keep referencing because it's kind of our the textbook of how we manage the National Flood Insurance Program. There's a component in 44 CFR 60.3A2 that basically says that We implement the National Flood Insurance Program with our local community participation and through the floodplain permits that local communities that have the land use authority to do so issue permits. We need to ensure that those permits associated with floodplain management under this program are in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And so that's kind of a weird way for a federal agency and a local community to have a coordinated approach to making sure we meet that ESA compliance, but it really comes down to the fact that the federal government doesn't have land use authority in local towns and counties and various municipalities, tribes as well, throughout the country that are actually implementing the regulations associated with the National Flood Insurance Program and implementing the maps that they adopt as part of their local zoning. So I think we can go to the next slide. And I just to provide some context, in Oregon, we're talking about salmon primarily and salmon habitat. So we have a wide variety of salmon species that are either threatened or endangered on the Endangered Species Act list, as well as some feeder fish like Eulishan, who's listed here. I think that's number 6, yep. And our iconic southern resident killer whales. And there's a connection there because we don't necessarily impact critical habitat for the southern resident killer whales, but the Chinook salmon is their primary feed source. And the Chinook, being an endangered species, has a direct impact on the survival and recovery of the southern residents. So next slide. The other major component in talking about salmon and ESA in the state of Oregon is the fact that we, back in 2009, I believe, FEMA entered into consultation with the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service. And that's a formal process in which the National Marine Fisheries Service, who manages the Endangered Species Act, talks with FEMA as a partner federal agency to discuss how our implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program impacts these listed species. It was determined through a long process that the National Flood Insurance Program does cause jeopardy to the species that you saw in the last slide. And as a result of that jeopardy determination, FEMA is now working to implement kind of an alternative approach to performance standards within the state of Oregon, so that we can implement the program in a way that creates no net loss for these listed species. That planning process has been going on for about the past year, and we have done a lot of stakeholder engagement, mostly with local governments and tribes around around most of the state of Oregon. And if you want to find out more about that process, our website that we set up for the project is OregonNFIP.org. That link is on the slide. If you've got the PDF handout, that should work. Otherwise, maybe we can get that in the chat for folks to check out. There's recordings of various webinars that we've held, along with a lot of additional background resources, so you can kind of brush up on what it means to have a biological opinion on the way we implement this floodplain management program in the state. And there's opportunities for you to provide feedback to us on the process that we've set out so far. In the next few months, we'll be putting out kind of our rough draft of an implementation plan for a final round of stakeholder feedback. And so when that information is ready to share, we'll be sending that out to folks who have signed up for our mailing list, which you can sign up for on OregonNFIP.org. And we'll just be looking for comments on that draft document as a final step of public process before we take it into a more formal government NEPA review process. So feel free to reach out to me directly if you have questions about that. It's not at all tied to the policy rescindment that I'm going to start talking about here in a minute, but there's definitely some overlap because it's all talking about salmon habitat and as we've been going through this stakeholder engagement process. For this effort, we've gotten a lot of questions about why we're changing the way we do habitat restoration and stuff. So I'll get into that next, but just wanted to point out that this is happening. So let me know if you have any questions on that, and then we can dive into this fish enhancement structures policy. So this policy was issued in 1999 after the year prior. Several species in the Northwest were proposed to be listed on the Endangered Species Act. A variety of salmonids. I believe most of what I included in that list for the Oregon salmonids, and then a few others that were also listed in the Puget Sound. So kind of as a response to those proposed listings, FEMA wanted to recognize that this was happening and show that we do encourage these habitat restoration projects to continue. The policy wanted to ensure that FEMA wasn't a hindrance to the continued habitat restoration efforts in the Northwest region, what the policy called fish enhancement projects, but really fish habitat enhancement projects is the more appropriate term, because the goal is to enhance the habitat, not to enhance the fish. Anyway, minor detail there. So the policy also intended to support communities by, in a way, allowing for rises to happen in the floodway for fish habitat restoration projects. So that's kind of the gist of what the policy intended to do. But if we go to the next slide, where we kind of get into where some of the confusion laid, was that the policy didn't do several of the things that folks thought that it did. So it was a regional policy in effect just in Region 10 states. So that includes Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. And because it was just a regional policy, we couldn't waive any of the federal regulations associated with these projects. And again, we're referencing the Code of Federal Regulations, two sections, 60.3 D3 and D4, which respectively require a hydraulic analysis for any project that occurs in the floodway. And that hydraulic analysis is to determine whether the project will result in an increase of the base flood elevation at that location. And D4 requires that a conditional letter of map revision be completed if a rise to the base flood elevation is caused by a project. So the policy also did not require or did not waive the requirement for a hydrologic and hydraulic analysis. H&H analysis, kind of the same effort you go through to get the no rise that Celinda mentioned, to determine if a project has an effect on the BFE. That has always been required, even though the policy kind of led to some confusion around that. The policy also didn't change any of the requirements for completing a conditional letter of map revision prior to project approval and permitting. There was definitely some confusion around there. So this policy was issued back in the late 90s, and it kind of just was out there having its own impact on floodplain management in the region without much trickling up to the surface until recently, when headquarters asked that we revisit the policy, and through some analysis both at the region and with FEMA headquarters, it was determined that Region 10 should rescind the policy because we didn't have the authority to waive federal regulations through that policy. So effective back in August, we rescinded that policy, and as of now, we are not, that policy should not be in use anywhere in the region. So that begs a question. Thanks, Celinda. Can habitat restoration projects still continue? There was a lot of confusion about what was and wasn't needed for habitat restoration projects. So it seemed like we had really made it a lot easier for these projects to continue. the fact is that these projects definitely still can continue, and we definitely still want to see habitat restoration work happening throughout the region. There's just a few things that need to be checked off the box in order for them to happen. So a floodplain permit has always been required and should always, going forward, be issued for these sorts of projects. If the project is happening in a mapped floodway, we want to make sure that there is a hydraulic analysis completed so that everybody knows for sure whether the project is going to have an impact on the base flood elevation. And that's ultimately our way of documenting the risk associated with changing any of the flow of a floodplain throughout an entire basin. A project should also, if it's causing a BFE change and increase, go through the conditional letter of map revision process. So if we go to the next slide, the floodway encroachment analysis is the guidance that FEMA has put out for doing this H&H analysis or the no-rise analysis. We've got a lot of different names for the same thing. And as I mentioned, the Code of Federal Regulations does require that this analysis be done for any development within FEMA's regulatory floodway. And so if you reach out to either Cylinder or I, we can get you that specific analysis so that you can determine if a project that you're currently working on or a future project will have an impact to the base flood elevation. The no-rise analysis or the floodway encroachment analysis should be conducted by a licensed professional engineer, and it does require some hydraulic modeling to be done to show where that rise happens and to what extent. So if we go to the next slide, more specifics on the conditional letter of map revision process, and just to better define what the CLOMR is, as we like to call it. It's called a letter, and it's really kind of FEMA's opportunity to comment on a proposed project. And through that comment process, FEMA determines whether, upon construction, a project would affect the hydrologic or hydraulic characteristics of a flooding source, and thus result in the modification of the existing regulatory floodplain that we have mapped in that area. The MT2 form is our process for completing that that CLOMR application. So if you go to FEMA's website, Celinda included a link here. The MT2 form has lengthy instructions on how you actually complete the form and complete the CLOMR for submittal. Something that is a component of this process is property owner notifications. So any parcels impacted by the proposed project need to be notified if there's going to be a rise in that base flood elevation, because that could impact their structures on their property or their property in general. And the CLOMR process typically takes up to 90 days for review. If there's any additional information needed by the FEMA review team, they'll request that, and that may extend the time, but generally 90 days is what one should expect for that review process. There are, if you go to the next slide, I think, there are opportunities for habitat restoration projects themselves to have some fees waived in the application process. So there is still the CLOMR requirement if there is a rise in the BFE as determined by your analysis, and there are other fees associated with the overall application. But if your project meets the definition of habitat restoration as defined under the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act, the actual application fees for your project can be waived, and they can be pretty sizable fees. So this is not nothing. It's definitely something to pursue if you think your project will meet this definition. And generally the definition is pretty vague, but it's the manipulation of physical, chemical, or biological characteristics of a site with the goal of returning the majority of natural functions to the lost or degraded natural habitat or native habitat. So that encompasses most habitat restoration projects that I'm familiar with. If you want to talk with us about more specifics on that, let us know. But really, the application that is submitted is reviewed by a whole host of folks at FEMA, and that likely will ultimately come to those of us staffed at Region 10 for review as well. So in a nutshell, this is kind of what I just went over, and we can come back to this if there are specific questions once we're done. So if you're going forward with the project in the floodway, whether it's habitat restoration or not, and you don't have a rise in the BFE, you need to document that, show your work in your H&H analysis, and then you can move forward with that project so that FEMA can say, yep, this project is good to go. That local community made sure that the project they permitted did not cause a rise in the BFE. If there is a documented rise in the BFE, you want to make sure that your H&H analysis shows exactly what that means, and include that analysis in your CLOMR application, and then that'll be reviewed through the CLOMR review process. And I have here existing and pre-project conditions. That's in reference to the hydraulic modeling that's associated with your analysis. You're going to be analyzing the existing conditions prior to the project, of course, and then after your project is completed, there is likely the requirement to also do a letter of map revision that includes analysis showing the as-built conditions so that the maps are updated accordingly to show the changes in that flooding source. If you're going forward with a habitat restoration project, whether you have a rise or not, you want to document that in your H&H analysis. And then if there is a rise, go through that same CLOMR application and review process. And then in that application process, you'll want to justify how your project meets that definition of habitat restoration. And so that's basically the outline, and what we really want to stress, especially for folks working in the conservation world, is that we recognize that sometimes your grant funding can be pretty time limited, but we want to ensure that going forward, groups know to plan accordingly for the potential time and cost additions that may not have been incorporated in past projects, so that you aren't surprised by the requirement to do an H&H analysis down the road, and surprised by the costs associated not only with that, but with the potential CLOMR process that you might have to do. And so FEMA has folks who are well-versed in working with FEMA's own grant programs that kind of incorporate this component, but all of our floodplain management staff can kind of help you understand these components of the process to help you better plan as well. So time and money, always the biggest resource constraints that we all have, but definitely very important to keep into consideration as you go forward with these projects. So I guess with that, Celinda and myself have our contact information here. We are happy to answer questions now or in the future, and we want to make sure that that the rescindment of this policy is not anything that hinders the continuation of good restoration projects for getting that salmon habitat back throughout the state. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, hi, Erin and Celinda. Thank you. That was wonderful. I do have a couple of questions queued up here to ask from listeners. And if you have a question and you have not yet typed it in, this is the time to do it. So the first question is, could you speak specifically to projects like riparian plantings, invasive removal in the floodway?
Hi, so this is Celinda. I can start with this one. If it is just a planting that's hand planting or doesn't involve excavation, fill, or grading in the floodway, so you're just going in and planting new native species, removing invasive species, something like that, then you're not going to be required to do a full hydrologic, hydraulic engineering analysis or a no-rise analysis for that limited activity. If it's anything more major than that, so if it does involve grading, something that actually affects the topography of the floodway, that's when an engineering analysis is required. So excavation fill grading is really what would trigger that.
Okay, somebody asks, so is no LOMR required for habitat restoration projects?
Actually, Erin, that's a good point. I think it's always should be noted that anytime you have to do a conditional letter of map revision,
Right.
within 6 months of the project being completed, you have to do a letter of map revision, a LOMAR, because that's what officially then updates the maps and changes the BFEs on the maps so that when communities are permitting future development in that area, they'll have the right base flood elevation data.
Correct. Yes, my graphic excluded that very important information. Yeah, if a CLOMAR, then a LOMAR. So if the project must be reviewed for potential map revision before the project is approved, then that map revision, once the project is completed, must be documented in a letter of map revision. Thank you for asking that question. I will update my slides for future presentations.
So somebody asks, this is just required for work in mapped floodways and watersheds, including stream reaches that are not mapped. Is that correct?
Yeah, so under the National Flood Insurance Program, this would be required in mapped floodways on the FEMA flood insurance rate map. So if you're doing this work in an area that's not in a mapped floodway, that's not on a flood insurance rate map, which there are plenty of streams that aren't mapped, then this wouldn't apply. Local floodplain regulations are tied to the FEMA flood insurance rate maps and only apply to those areas mapped on them as the special flood hazard area, so the 100-year floodplain and the floodway. And the engineering no-rise analysis is only really a factor in the floodway because you're allowed to have a rise in the flood fringe and add fill to the flood fringe. Erin, do you want to add to that at all?
I think you covered it all. Yeah, when we're talking about the floodplain and the floodway, we're talking about those areas that have been mapped by FEMA or have mapping done by a community that has been approved by FEMA and then adopted into their local zoning.
Okay, good. Somebody asks, is the new federal administration going to impact this decision? And I'm going to tag a question onto that and ask if you had any speculations about other general changes coming down the pike, FEMA-wide or region-wide.
Excellent question. I don't believe there will be any changes in our headquarter decision to rescind this regional policy because of the fact that the policy made it easy to waive federal regulations. There's no interest in bringing this back. The only way we can change the way federal regulations are implemented is to do a national rule change that would affect the entire program across the country. And that's not something that headquarters is wanting to entertain at this time. And being the federal government, we don't really like to speculate, unfortunately, or for better or for worse, however you want to look at it. So, I mean, a new administration always brings lots of new opportunities. So we'll just see what happens.
I thought you would say that. Tried to sneak one in there. Okay. What if you are lowering the BFE, say by removing a low head dam? Do you still have to provide a CLOMR?
No, the conditional letter of map revision is only required if you're increasing the base flood elevation. And it really is the tool that FEMA uses to evaluate what that change will mean for properties downstream or impacted, so that if people built in compliance downstream and you're increasing it, it could really impact their structures now, kind of thing. So FEMA evaluates that through a CLOMAR. So if you're not having a rise, then a CLOMAR is not required.
Got it. Can you comment on use of two-dimensional hydraulic models, i.e. HECRAS, for changes to BFE?
So a lot of that would come down to a conversation with the FEMA Region 10 engineering staff or the CLOMAR review team, depending on which element you're talking about. If you're talking about the no-rise analysis or some other modeling done for the CLOMAR, about whether that's appropriate for that stream region situation. I know there is some allowance for 2D modeling, but I can't give it a blanket. It's always okay in every situation. I think that's something that's been kind of evolving of late. Do you have anything you want to add to that one, Erin?
I'm pulling up a link to share with Vanessa that she can share with the group on the FEMA Flood Mapping and Insurance Exchange, which is a good resource for folks to ask that question of our FEMA engineers to get more specific responses.
One last thing I'll add to that is with the no-rise and with the CLOMAR analysis, one of the keys is that FEMA typically wants you to start from their model and then show how in their modeling the impact would change or the proposal would change the BFEs, base flood elevations. And so if you need to get access to the existing models for an area, you can reach out to myself or Erin or to this other link that she's sending to get access to those.
Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, so I just sent that link out to everybody. So if you see a little blinking light in your chat function, that's where you will find the link that Erin referenced.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next question is, if the landowner owns all adjacent parcels, can they submit a letter saying they understand that there will be a BFE increase and they are comfortable with that change? That's a good question.
Unfortunately, I'm not aware of, it is a good question. I don't know if I've ever asked that exact specific situation question. I don't believe that would waive the need to go through the process because it is in the local floodplain regulations and in the federal statutes that you have to go through the process. But once again, I haven't ever really asked that specific question. If the rise only impacted them, then through the CLOMAR, you definitely have the CLOMAR approved. That wouldn't be an issue. So that would help with that part of it. But I think you'd likely still have to go through the no-rise and CLOMAR process. The no-rise certainly to know what the change would be and to verify that it just affected that landowner. The CLOMAR, you'd be documenting through that letter to FEMA that while it does create a rise, the property owner is okay with it. Part of that is because there's no guarantee that property owner will own that property forever.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Yeah, if you say are doing a project and it only impacts one property owner because of the size of the project or because that parcel or that collection of parcel is all owned by one entity, then your property owner notification process is going to be pretty simple. But yeah, it would not change the letter of map revision requirements at all because we're still going through this process to document changes to flood risk and changes that may invalidate the existing flood maps and require a revision of those maps.
Yeah, the letter of map revision process is really designed to keep the maps up to date since it is such a big epic thing to do a full countywide revision, 5-year, multi-million-dollar process. So doing the LOMAR process and the CLOMAR process is part of that, is to make sure that the maps stay up to date so communities can regulate with accurate data. So if they tell somebody, you build this high and you'll be safe, it's accurate.
That makes sense. So to whom do we apply for the application fee waiver for a CLOMR? Is that to the local government or to FEMA?
To FEMA. So the CLOMAR application is actually submitted through to FEMA directly. There's a link that's in our presentation that has the instructions and who to submit it to. And you'll need to know, as Erin mentioned on that slide, that it's for that. You'll need to note that on the application. And so it's to FEMA that you apply for the fee waiver.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. Can you confirm if the project meets habitat restoration definition, then all fees are waived for both CLOMR and LOMR review?
That's an excellent question. And as I was giving this presentation, I was trying to remember that answer. I would need to check on that. I'm not sure if it applies to LOMR fees.
Got it. Okay. No mention of excavation and fill trigger CLOMR/LOMR. How would projects that install large wood with no excavation or fill be handled?
So if it's in the floodway, if you're installing wood, it's still considered an encroachment into the floodway because you're adding mass into the floodway. And so at that point, you'd still have to do a rise analysis to see if it has any impact on the BFE, if it makes the water level go up in that 1% annual chance flood. If there is a rise, then that would trigger, it's the rise that triggers the CLOMR. If there isn't a rise, then you wouldn't need to do a CLOMR.
Got it. Is an H&H required for all of the hood zones within the SFHA, or is the floodway a specific zone?
It's the floodway, just for that no rise analysis is only required in the floodway, not in the flood fringe.
Okay. You guys are asking great questions, by the way. They're so specific. Are there exceptions to the need to perform hydraulic modeling based on scale? Hold on a second. Conducting fill on a small site within the lower Columbia River floodplain has no risk of raising the BFE. No modeling is required to know that. Does that matter?
The standard, and keep in mind, this is a national program and a national standard. And so it isn't always the best for each individual case-by-case assessment. I think I can safely say that. But I'd say let's have the conversation. I'm more than happy to put something forward, a letter from an engineer saying, you know, given these parameters and this situation and these factors, I don't believe a full H&H is required in this situation. It would have to go up to FEMA Region 10 engineering team to review and see if they agree with you. If they do, then there might be that they could put in writing to the community that in that exact situation, a full H&H analysis isn't required. I can't guarantee that that would be acceptable. The standard, what's in the regulations, kind of the law of the land is that an H&H analysis is required with that no rise. But I can't say that there would never be an exception. It would come down to the judgment and decision of the FEMA Region 10 engineering staff of whether an exception could be made.
Got it. Okay. Somebody asks, from the flow chart on slide 25, it appears from slide 25 that habitat restoration does not require an LOMR.
That was that question we had before. That's an error. So you'll got, unfortunately, well, Aaron can fix that. But this LOMR, this box, imagine it's over here in green too. Anytime you have to do a CLOMR, within 6 months of the project being finished, you have to do the LOMR because the CLOMR is a conditional letter of map revision, so it's a conditional approval. You have to do a LOMR then to then prove that what you did was what you said you were going to do at the beginning. You didn't change it, and that it's the official actual change of the map. So the LOMR actually officially updates them so that communities can regulate to that new revised version.
Somebody comments, it seems that the base conditions of many stream systems are severely degraded, downcut, incised, etc., and the attention to restore floodplain restoration, it seems the engineering standards of FEMA are very counter to natural stream processes.
Yeah, you can make that argument. The engineering standards and the mapping standards really are focused on managing and documenting the flood risk associated in an area and managing for those changes in BFE. one of those future changes that I would love to see is to see see this situation be updated such that habitat restoration projects and the potential for rise through the good work of adding root wads or such that when you're adding to a stream structure and causing rise, it's actually beneficial to the system and the environment surrounding, as well as the critical habitat. So that is not the case with our regulations right now, unfortunately. But we are hoping that that habitat restoration projects continue, and we continue to fight for rule changes that actually better reflect the work that is done in the floodway. That's my personal view.
Somebody asks, is wood considered fill?
Large woody debris is considered fill. There's, I don't know, Erin, if you want to address that further.
I would also say yes, if it's something, if you think the analogy we like to use in the office is the bathtub. If you have a bathtub with X amount of water in it, you throw a few bricks in there, that water is going to rise. Anything that you are putting into the floodway to encroach on that floodway and will cause a rise is something that is filling that floodway.
Somebody asks, what is the cost of the analysis?
So the H&H analysis and the cost of that ranges broadly. And I say that not to get out of giving an answer, but because depending on the stream and the existing modeling information and how big of a stream reach you're doing, you know, it's just got a wide range of what you can do. There, you can reach out. There's a lot of consultants that have experience doing this because unfortunately there is development that has over the years occurred in the floodway that we're trying to mitigate and remove, but there is a wide group of consultants and different folks that do have experience that could give you quotes or estimates. I don't have a good average because it varies so drastically based on those factors, but it is paying a licensed engineer to do modeling information. And so, you know, based on those rates, it isn't the cheapest thing.
Got it. Is there a set time for review by FEMA?
So after the process is you turn in typically the floodplain permit to the community. They'll require the no rise analysis. If there's a rise, then you'll be required to submit to FEMA the CLOMAR application. Erin, do you have an average time frame for how long it takes FEMA to do those CLOMAR reviews that you can provide?
Typically, a CLOMAR should be reviewed in a 90-day period, unless additional information is requested from the applicant by FEMA. So that's generally the timing expectation. If additional data is needed, that can vary quite a bit.
Okay. On slide 21, is the floodplain permit that you are referencing one that is issued by FEMA or one that would be issued by a county, etc.? In our case, we have been working with the county already and have determined we need to do an H&H as well as a non-structural floodplain development permit application. Is there an additional FEMA permit in conjunction with this, or just one issued by the county?
It's just the county. So FEMA doesn't issue permits for specific development activities within the floodplain. It's all done by the local community. The state doesn't issue them either. Just to clarify, we provide technical assistance if the local community has questions about how to interpret their floodplain regulations or how to help an applicant through the permitting process. And we try to help them do that as efficiently as possible. But so just that county one that you're working on, that's the only one needed. You don't have to do any additional ones with FEMA or the state.
Okay, good. Somebody had a comment, and I'm not sure if it was attached to a previous question. My apologies. They said, think about private timber ownership. Do you have any comments about that?
I'm not sure what that's reference to. once again, FEMA floodplain maps tend to don't cover every place. There's a lot of state, federal lands and private timberlands also that don't have FEMA floodplain mapping because they're focused on areas of development. The funding for the mapping and the effort is focused on where people are. So I don't know if that was maybe in reference to that, but it's my best guess.
Okay. Why
And
are
I
no-rise
will,
analyses not? Oh, go ahead, Erin. Sorry about that.
I believe the fee waiver for applications associated with the conditional letter of map revision are also is also a fee waiver that exists for the letter of map revision. I've been doing a little bit of sleuthing while we've been going through the questions, and our assumption is that it applies to both.
Good. Okay. Why are no-rise analyses not required on federal land?
Well, if it's in the if it's in a special flood hazard area that is regulated by the local community on there and it's shown on a FEMA flood insurance rate map in a floodway, then it is required. But I'm just saying that a lot of where FEMA spends their money, where we have floodplain mapping, FEMA floodplain mapping typically is where our development is. So in our communities or in the portions of counties where we have development. And so and I only know this because I looked at it up once, there's lots of forest, federal, state lands that don't have a lot of development within those areas that basically haven't come up as a priority enough yet for FEMA to spend the money to map them. And one thing to keep in mind is that FEMA mapping dollars are limited. We have to compete with all the other states in the nation for them. And so we're constantly trying to get more money for more floodplain mapping, but there are lots of portions of the state that don't have any FEMA floodplain mapping on them for that reason. So if that answers the question.
Got it. Somebody says that this is a follow-up question. Is the floodway zone A?
So a floodway, so on the FEMA maps, and I can actually, well, instead of going to the slides, riverine zones are always start with the letter A. There'll be A, AE, AO, something like that. And then the floodway is just its own zone, just called the floodway. It's always going to be within a riverine zone because you can't map a floodway in a coastal tidally influenced area. But so the floodway is always going to be within a riverine zone, but it is the portion of the zone, it'll have its own delineation. It'll have that hatching on it. Actually, I can go back to that slide and show that. Bear with me really quick. It was back at the beginning. So this is called floodway. The zone AE, that references the underlying zone, but the floodway trumps it. So the hatched area represents the floodway, and that's its own kind of unique polygon on the GIS data.
Okay. This one says, question to Erin. I presume these considerations apply to other Region X states, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska?
Considerations for habitat, I think maybe is what the question's getting at, or
I'm so sorry.
if that's the case, technically,
I guess let me rephrase the question and hopefully we can get it. Are there any rules that you have gone over or issues pertain only to Oregon and not to other states in the region?
So the only thing we've talked about here today that only applies to Oregon is this planning that we're doing to implement the biological opinion that was issued for the majority of Oregon watersheds that have salmon-bearing habitat. The policy rescindment related to fish habitat enhancement structures applies region-wide.
Okay. What resources are available for small entities to obtain the effective models to use for the CLOMER analysis? Does the state have access to these models? Apologies if this has already been asked.
That's fine. We don't have a library of them ourselves, but we can request them for you. And there is also a formal request process. The link that is in the chat box is the link to basically the FEMA Mapping Information Exchange Group or the FEMA Library. And they have a really simple form you just fill out to indicate which community, which, what you're looking for, what area, and you can request the model through that process. And if you have any questions on that or need any help with that, you can reach out to me. And if you run into any issues, you can reach out to me and I can always go to the region via email and request it directly too. So there's either Erin or I can help you if you ever have trouble, but there is a set process through that website that you can just fill out a form and request the effective model.
Okay. Could you go through what agency is in charge of receiving which applications? For example, it sounds like H&H goes to county first, and only if RISE is determined, then the applicant goes directly to FEMA for CLOMR and LOMR. Or does the local agency submit to FEMA?
So that's a good question. So the application and the H&H for RISE go to the local community. And if there is a RISE, the community will instruct essentially the applicant to submit an application directly to FEMA. And so there is a little piece of the form, it's called the community acknowledgement form, where when you fill out the application, the CLOMR application to give it to FEMA, you take it in and the community signs it, basically acknowledging that they're aware that you're doing this project and applying for this CLOMR. But the application is submitted to FEMA for the CLOMR directly. And there's an online portal to do that, or there's instructions where you can mail it in.
Okay. It sounds like restoration projects might be on the hook for paying for the LOMR. What is an average LOMR? I already talked about that a little bit, but is there another angle to that question?
So did we just determine that, Erin, did you confirm there isn't a fee for a LOMR if it's a habitat restoration project that meets that definition?
We can try to get some better clarification, but it's our understanding that the application fee could also be waived for the LOMR that you do after the project is completed. But there would still be other costs associated with completing the LOMR, making sure you have the as-built properly documented so that FEMA can revise the map appropriately. And those costs associated with that would really depend on the scale of the project itself.
So the full standard LOMR fee, if there wasn't a waiver, is around $8,000. It sounds like that there will be a waiver for those that qualify as habitat restoration for that cost, but there is, I think what Erin's alluding to is to prepare the package to actually, get the documentation together to submit it. It may cost a bit of money that it's not in the application fee itself, but there's cost to pay your consultant or yourself essentially for time to get the information put together. Is that a fair summary, Erin?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Somebody says, thank you for your presentation today. The FEMA policy on Oregon projects will be quite onerous in terms of time and money. If a project is already approved and permits in place, may a project go forward in 2021?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
We're not planning on, we're not planning on retroactively enforcing something different than what was in place.
And that's been communicated to the local communities that if there's already permits issued or underway, that they don't have to rescind those or do anything to them. Everything that's already in the process or approved can continue on. It'll just be for future ones.
Okay. Is there anything we can do as fish habitat enhancement project sponsors that can speed up a new national policy that will allow us to rebuild these floodways for the benefit of ESA listed species?
Promote a rule change. Can I get to say it because I won't put Aaron on the spot. So the FEMA employee, promote a rule change to the Code of Federal Regulations for the National Flood Insurance Program would be helpful.
Noted. I hope you all were listening. Okay. All right. There are still several more questions, everybody. You guys are doing a great job. These are all really pertinent.
Yeah, thank you.
Sounds like the H&H might demonstrate. Oh, yeah. It sounds like the H&H might demonstrate that rises, perhaps significant rises, might occur. This needs to be documented through the Clomer-Lomer process, and landowners will be notified. But approval of habitat restoration projects are likely to be granted if structures are not impacted.
Yes, I think you're talking about the likelihood of a CLOMAR being approved by FEMA, and if structures aren't impacted, then you have a very solid likelihood that FEMA would approve that CLOMAR. They typically always do if there are no structures impacted. If there's a rare situation, because normally habitat restoration, you're obviously trying to improve the situation, not create new flood risk downstream. But you know, the CLOMAR is really kind of that gatekeeping process, but you're correct. If it's not going to impact structures, then it shouldn't have any issues getting approved, based on my experience.
Okay. This next one is a comment, so maybe you can just tell us if you think it sounds right or if it needs some clarification. Just to give folks an idea of cost, they will need a site survey to establish elevations. This will cost $5,000 and up. The cost to run the hydraulic model and write CLOMAR report is $5,000 and up. A minimum of $10,000 is typically needed.
It sounds like that's coming from a consultant, hopefully, and if that is, I won't question their numbers in any way. I will say that using the FEMA models does provide, typically the newer models at least have LIDAR data and survey data included in that model information. So I don't know if that was taking that into account, but like I said, I can't speak to exact costs, so that sounds like a possibility.
Okay. Somebody asks on slide 24, when you state must be partially funded by federal or state funds, what are you referencing?
So the project that qualifies as a habitat restoration project needs, in order to be eligible for this fee waiver, needs to show how the project is being funded in whole or in part, maybe with matching funds through state or federal monies. Let me know if that doesn't answer the question.
Somebody is asking, if there is no FEMA map, does that mean that there is no engineering required?
Yeah, if there's no FEMA map, then there's no floodplain permit required. None of this is required. It's only when there's a FEMA map, and only when there's a FEMA mapped 100-year floodplain with a floodway.
Okay. To clarify, are the requirements for H&H not required for properties that do not have floodplain maps by FEMA? I guess you just answered that.
Yeah, that's yes.
Okay. All right. I think Celinda just said that there is no floodway designation in tidally influenced areas. Does that mean that the requirements for H&H, et cetera, do not apply in tidally influenced areas, even along rivers?
Yeah, so you'll have the area where the estuary area where the river and the tidal influence interact, the ocean interact, and typically what you'll see, like if you look at Tillamook or any of the coastal communities, the river mapping, floodplain mapping goes up to a point and then it transitions to coastal mapping. We have coastal flood zones, start with a V typically. There can be still some AE riverine zones that are in that kind of right at the transition point, but the floodway will always end shy of where the tidally influenced area is. And so this only applies in a mapped floodway. So the tidally influenced areas, you shouldn't be seeing, or you wouldn't be seeing any floodway mapping in that area. So you wouldn't have the no rise requirement there. So this really only applies in riverine areas that don't have tidal influences where there's a mapped floodway. If you want a good example of that, you can take a look at Tillamook, some of their coastal riverine intersections.
Okay. How does the 90-day review period for the CLOMR fit into the permitting process? Oh, sorry, hold on. Okay. How does the 90-day review process for the CLOMR fit into the permitting process? Would the local floodplain permit not be issued until the LOMR is complete?
Yeah, so basically the permitting review process pauses while you submit the CLOMR application. The local community can't approve the permit until FEMA signs off on the CLOMR if it is going to be a rise, and that's kind of specified in the local floodplain regulations. It says no rise is allowed unless a FEMA approved CLOMR, and so, or wording to that effect. And so essentially they have to wait for that CLOMR to be approved before they can finalize and issue the permit. I have seen on rare cases a community go out on the limb and issue a permit with a condition that, but we don't ever advise that, because if for some reason FEMA did reject the CLOMR, then there'd be a lot of trouble for everybody. So the CLOMR really has to be approved before they can go forward. And if a community tells you otherwise, maybe send them to me to make sure they're not going to get themselves in trouble.
Okay, good. Why is this policy change being put forward now, and why not at some point in the past?
Because headquarters got wind that it still existed. That's really the only reason that it's happening now. There's not any connection with the other ESA work happening in Oregon. Again, it's a region-wide policy. Yeah, it was brought to headquarters' attention, and we had to take a look at it, and headquarters made their decision to have us rescind it.
If there are no structures in a Zone A reach, is a CLOMR still required? What about bridges?
CLOMRs are required for bridges. If there's a rise, a CLOMR is required. That's the set requirement. Most bridges always require a CLOMR and then a LOMR afterwards. If they're going to touch in the floodway, I guess, unless they're so big and high that they span the full length of the floodway and no abutment is in the floodway and the bridge top is above the elevation of the floodway, that might be the only time you could get out of that. But in general, the answer is yes, they always need a CLOMR and then a LOMR, as far as I understand it.
Okay. What role did the affected landowner opinion have in FEMA's approval process for a CLOMR?
I believe all property owners impacted by the project have to approve of the project going forward. Is that correct, Sandra?
Well, they're notified, and then they have a time period where if they have a concern or an issue, they can raise it, and then FEMA would take that into consideration. If they just don't like the project, that's not going to stop it. If they built their house to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and so their house would be dry now and the water's going to go up 2 feet, and now they could be looking at their house being wet in a flood event, then that could have a negative impact on the project.
Okay. I just want to do a time check for the group. I have 2 more questions left in the queue, and we have 10 more minutes. So if I ask these last 2 questions and there are no others, we will just go ahead and wrap up. But it's last call, so if you have any other questions that you want to throw in there, now is the time. Okay. If the project is being conducted under an exemption through voluntary restoration activities, can CLOMR's fee still be waived?
All right, can you repeat that question?
Yeah. If the project is being conducted under an exemption through voluntary restoration activities, can CLOMR's fees still be waived?
As in, if the project doesn't have federal or state funding associated with it?
So I think if it meets what's on this slide 24, if it has a dollar of federal or state funding and meets that definition, then it could be waived, and that would include if it was a voluntary one. If it doesn't meet that, then I don't know the answer, and I'll have to pass that over to Erin.
Yeah, Vanessa, if you want to send me that question, I can try to get a more specific answer on that. I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Tell you what, the person who asked that question, if that answer was not satisfactory, why don't you contact Erin directly at her contact information that she listed on her last slide? Okay. All right, let me type that.
Thank you.
Too. Okay. Voluntary in accordance with ODSL. A lot of small projects that cannot be funded through government funding paths are often done by landowners without much financial backing. That is actually the same person that asked that first part, so maybe that is a clarification to the first question.
So maybe we need to, Erin, is that something you can find out and respond to, and then you can respond directly to them, and then maybe Vanessa, we can share the answer with you too, so that you can share it with folks that interact with you at the partnership too.
Yep. Yeah, Vanessa,
Perfect.
Can you just copy and paste that question over to me so I can make sure I ask the appropriate question, get it so I get it right?
Yep, I can do that. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. And then, is there a rise that is contained on the project property that, oh, sorry, let me start again. If there is a rise that is contained on the project property, would a CLOMR still be required? There would be no impact to adjacent properties.
So, and just to be sure I get it, by being contained, so it's a single owner, the property is going on. I think it kind of goes back to the same answer we gave to a previous question. Typically, the CLOMR is going to be required if there's a rise, period, and then the LOMAR to update the BFEs on the map to show what that new correct BFE is for that area. That's my understanding. If it's the only exception, and it kind of raised a cut and fill situation, so if that rise is offset within the same property, and then really in the modeling there isn't a rise, maybe there's a situation there where it wouldn't. That's kind of getting into the weeds. So if whoever's asked this wants to follow up with me, feel free to. But in general, anytime there's a rise, even if it's contained in one property, you still have to do the CLOMR.
Okay, got it. Looks like there's one more question. Hold on just a second. Okay. Oh. Can Erin send in the updated image for slide 25 so that we can all access it? I'm sending notes to our staff and would like to include that corrected graphic. Can I speak to that actually? To the person who asked that question, maybe what we could do is if you correct that slide, Erin, can you send a corrected version of the PDF to me? And then I will post that corrected version to our website. So when this recording is available, the corrected slide will be included in the whole PDF available to everybody. Is that acceptable?
Happy to do that, yep.
Okay, and then that gives you a little bit of time to make sure it's just right. Okay.
Sounds
All right.
good.
I think that's it for the questions. That was very productive, and I know that this is not very welcome news across our constituencies, and it's going to be a lot to handle, but I think that it's very helpful for people to get accurate information that is available for statewide use. And it's also valuable to us to see some names and faces and wise words behind the policies. So I really want to thank you for making your contact information available and to being open to questions that you might receive from participants that were here today. So on behalf of Oregon Conservation Partnership, I want to thank Aaron Cooper and Celinda Adair for joining us and for developing this presentation. And for participants, thanks for joining us today, and come back next month. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.